guess the one thing people always ask about oracles is, how do you ensure that the information provided is accurate and it's not malicious or false?
This optimistic concept is actually pretty simple. And the idea here, the optimistic part, is if nobody says that response is wrong during that challenge window, it gets taken as truth. So optimistically, we prove something to be true, or we say this is true. If, however, somebody's like, that's not right, that data is wrong, and they challenge it, then we call it a dispute, and it gets elevated to a second system. That's basically the pessimistic outcome. The pessimistic system, where we have this Schelling point of voting system design, where the UMA token holders vote on the outcome. In computer science, the concept here is like lazy evaluation too, where if I don't need to do this extra work of like proving what the outcome should be, I'm not going to do it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ben, and as usual, I'm the host for today's podcast. Today, we have a very special guest. His name is Hart Lambur, the co-founder of UMA. Welcome to the show, Hart.
Hey, Ben. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, great to have you. And as always, before we start off the session, we always like to ask our speakers, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and how did you get started in crypto?
Yeah, absolutely. So I studied computer science in university back in the day, and then ended up working as a bond trader at Goldman Sachs through the financial crisis, which is not something I expected to do. So I did that for 8 years, which feels like a lifetime. Learned a lot about finance, learned a lot about financial engineering. Was also exposed to Bitcoin there. Fred Urson was at Goldman at the same time. And so I actually know him. He's the guy that told me about Bitcoin before he started Coinbase. And that was pretty cool. In 2013, I left to start a fintech business called OpenFolio that was really focused on helping investors make better investment decisions. And that got acquired in 2017. And then at that point in time, I got really interested in how to use a smart contract platform like Ethereum to write financial contracts. And this was before DeFi existed as a concept. But I was drawn to this in kind of the 2018 timeframe. And that's when we went out to start or found UMA.
Right. So it's funny that you mentioned the Goldman Sachs thing, starting off during the session, because that it's kind of my experience now, because this is my first crypto bear market recession. So it's great you brought it up, it's where you learn the most.
Yeah, you learn the most when things go sideways. And, my experience at Goldman through the financial crisis really was wild. And I was like a young guy, right? So, but man, you watched financial markets fall apart and the wheels really come off. And there's a lot you just learn in those experiences. So it was quite something.
You mentioned that you founded the UMA protocol, but what exactly is UMA?
Yeah, totally. So UMA is what we're calling an optimistic oracle. And so this is a type of oracle that can get any type of data, any type of verifiable data onto any blockchain. And it's designed to work differently than some of the other oracle designs in the space, most broadly known as Chainlink, which sort of pushes a limited set of price feed data onto chain. This is a much more generalized concept where you can ask the optimistic oracle any question, and through the game theory and the incentive mechanism design, be guaranteed to get a truthful answer back.
Interesting, because to me this sounds a bit like what Augur used to do. Kind of like what prediction markets was initially conceived on DeFi and on chain, and it's kind of like taking the same concept. But correct me if I'm wrong.
No, Ben, you're spot on. Like Augur was like it's worth providing some context here. So back in 2017, 18, we're thinking like, okay, wait, it would be cool to write financial contracts on a blockchain. What do we need to do that? And if you want to know, kind of my model for it is there's two components. There's the logic of the contract, the like if this then that, which you can program on a smart contract platform easily. And then there's the inputs of like, well, did this event happen, or like what is this price, or whatever else. And that's what we now know as the Oracle problem. And Augur, in some ways, built this integrated system of saying, hey, my contract is a prediction market, and my Oracle is this interesting sort of Schelling point like design. But those two were tightly integrated. And in some ways, and there's many differences here, but in some ways, what we've actually done at UMA is sort of separate the Schelling point like Oracle that was embedded in Augur and made it not like integrated with just these prediction markets. It's designed such that any developer can use it. And we can get into some use cases.
Yeah, amazing. And I guess the one thing people always ask about oracles is, how do you ensure that the information provided is accurate and it's not malicious or false?
Yeah, so like it's worth getting into the design at least a high level, and we can keep digging in deeper. This optimistic concept is actually pretty simple. So in our Oracle system, unlike something like, say, Chainlink, which is again pushing data onto a blockchain, in our Oracle system, any contract can ask any question. And so like you, Ben, could ask the question, who won the soccer game last night, or what it might be. Like again, think prediction markets are kind of useful. Who won the election? Who won the soccer game? And it can, of course, be price data too. Like, what was the price of so-and-so at this point in time? Anyone can ask that question, and then anyone on the blockchain can respond. The responder has to post a bond for economic incentives, which we can get into. And once the responder responds, a challenge period starts. And the challenge period can be set by the designer of the system, whoever's making the call. And the idea here, the optimistic part, is if nobody says that response is wrong during that challenge window, it gets taken as truth. So optimistically, we prove something to be true, or we say this is true. If, however, somebody's like, that's not right, that data is wrong, and they challenge it, then we call it a dispute, and it gets elevated to a second system that's basically the pessimistic outcome. The pessimistic system, where we have this Schelling point of voting system design, where the UMA token holders vote on the outcome, and we can get into how that works. But the idea here is that the vast majority of Oracle requests actually just get resolved at the optimistic level. And so we have very, very few disputes that we have to do extra work on. And the concepts here, they do follow from like optimistic rollups or all these other types of designs. And in computer science, the concept here is like lazy evaluation too, where if I don't need to do this extra work of like proving what the outcome should be, I'm not going to do it. And so optimistically, we just keep going through, hey, do people agree with this answer? Does anyone disagree? Does anyone disagree? Does anyone disagree? And the vast majority of the questions that this system gets used for do get resolved at this first layer, which makes it like cheap and easy.
It's interesting you raise that, because I'm actually curious, what, if any, do people or these protocols or normal protocols like this Oracle individuals, entities reject this information? Like, could you give an example where that has happened? Because I think for the vast majority of us, we don't really have an idea of what goes on behind the scenes. So it'd be interesting to, share your perspective on this, or maybe some even interesting statistics behind this. Like how often do disputes occur?
Yeah, so disputes occur like infrequently, but not never. Like we basically have a dispute or two a month, maybe 4, something like that.
Okay.
And so let's get like, what are some examples? So one of the things that UMA Oracle is being used for is to power Polymarket, which is a prediction market, a lot like Augur. So we'll go back, and so it's actually like proving kind of true. This isn't this. Polymarket switched to using UMA relatively recently. Before they were doing this in a centralized way. And so now Polymarket asks lots of questions to the optimistic oracle that are the prediction markets they support. And so some examples of disputes we have are really related to kind of technical details of their questions. So, one example, they're related to things like, does the specific language of the question, like technically the language of the question might say, hey, so-and-so didn't compete in whatever, but the reason why they didn't compete is because the tournament was canceled or something like that. And so then you have, what you end up having is sort of a situation where there is more than one reasonable outcome. Like you can argue either way what's reasonable. And those, I think, are the most interesting types of disputes, because then we actually, the goal of the system, and again, this isn't the pessimistic path, the goal of the system is to figure out what the most reasonable outcome is and return that. And I'd say that like it's worked pretty well to date. Again, it's when you're asking a question that has some ambiguity, that there is some room for interpretation, it does mean that like there is potentially more than one correct answer. And our goal then is to return. The goal of the system should be to return the most correct answer.
Yeah, this sounds a lot like court, because I'm an ex-lawyer myself. And it really sounds like, it's how parties will argue over whose argument is more correct, what points are more accurate. And it sounds exactly like that. It's like a dispute resolution system, arbitration.
That's right. That's exactly right. And I actually, Ben, I'd go further and say, if you think of court systems or legal systems, they are also optimistically enforced, or I'll make the argument of that. Where like, Ben, you and I write a contract under the laws of the state of New York. And we both hope that we won't have to sue each other. We optimistically hope we're going to follow the contract. But we do, if we disagree with the contract being followed, we do have recourse to sue. And it's the exact same concept. So the optimistic oracle means we're trying to just have everybody agree. But what's actually really cool is we're doing this at like, I'll say it at like a global level, like at a network level. Like anyone can disagree with the outcome, and then it goes to dispute resolution. So the system has worked really well. It works beautifully for things like prediction markets, like asking, sports data, election data, anything that it's just, to back up, getting that information on chain in a decentralized way is really tricky. And so this is a very it's a pretty cool way of doing it. It also works great for other examples where you just want some data, like any type of data that is also difficult to get on chain. And I think we can talk a little bit later about cross-chain stuff too. Like this is a great way to verify whether something happened on another blockchain. We can do that optimistically too.
Very cool. And so, I actually have one question about this, is because ultimately it is a dispute resolution system. And to me, the system sounds like it relies a lot on game theory and, for everyone to work to their economic benefit. But, there might be situations where market participants are irrational, Is that possible? And if so, can this system address that?
I think that's a nuanced and deep question. It's probably a lot of angles to look at there. So if we think about the two layers here, the optimistic oracle layer, and then if there is a dispute, it goes to what we call the DVM, but it's the UMA token holders resolving the outcome, which we can talk a little bit more about. If we go to the first layer, The first layer requires there to be one honest participant. And as long as there's one honest observer of the data that will say that's not right, that will dispute that data if they see it, as long as that exists, then I think we are good at the first layer, at the optimistic oracle layer, right? Because you don't need everyone to be economically rational. You just need like one person to say, hey, I disagree with that. When a dispute happens, that dispute gets escalated to the UMA token holders. That design of how they vote on the outcome is heavily inspired by both Augur and also something Vitalik wrote like in 2014 called Shelling Coin, because Vitalik comes up with all the good ideas. But the Shelling Coin is this Shelling point voting system where you vote in secret. So everybody vote. They vote and commit in secret, and then they reveal their votes. And the game theory is that people are designed to vote the truth, vote what they think the truth is. And so, you know, if you're looking at this and the game theory of it, it'd be pretty hard for you'd effectively need half of the voters to act irrationally in order for this to not play out. Is that possible? I suppose, but it's hard to kind of imagine like what that situation would look like.
I mean, when you put it that way, it's like, you know, taking over 51% of the Bitcoin mining network, and as everyone has pointed out, that's also very difficult. So it's a similar kind of security feature, or a subset of decentralization.
No, that's exactly right. Like so just on the UMA token holders, when they vote on these disputes, the voters that vote, that participate and vote with the majority, they receive a reward. And the ones that don't, they get penalized because they don't receive that reward. And so if you think about it, it is like a blockchain. It's like our token holders. One weird analogy, it's almost like our token holders are like a human by hand blockchain, where they're like, you're rewarding the people that are agreeing on a given outcome in that vote, which I find a really fun and kind of cool way to think about it. It's like human powered blockchain, but happens really slowly. Like it takes like 2 days to kind of mine this block and achieve this consensus in the dispute period. But you really do have this kind of 51% attack like concept, like the game theory kind of distills to that too. So as long as no one's controlling 51% of the voting supply, you look good.
Now, you kind of raised the point about token holders, right? And I want to ask, like, what role does the UMA token play in the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, again, it is the voting token. So one of the things, it's kind of interesting, going back to when we were designing this system back in 2018, tokens back then were considered evil. It's actually interesting to go back to that point in time. Tokens were evil because we were coming out of the 2017 like ICO boom, and everybody's just like, there was all the just bad taste, like all this kind of garbage. And, you know, I first of all think tokens done correctly are incredibly cool. They're like the coolest, one of the cooler things about crypto. And for the UMA system, they're key and critical. Like it is this voting right and the UMA token, and we need it to have the game theory work. It just does not work if we don't have this token. And so again, owning the token gives you access to vote in these disputes. And if you vote and participate, you get rewarded more UMA tokens. You get inflationary rewards. And we can't design that. It doesn't work if we don't have without that core embedded system. So it's really core to the whole logic of how the system works and core to our value capture.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, there's always this stigma against tokens, and I think just as recently as today, over the bear market, we see everything dropping. But like you said, there are a lot of systems that rely on having a effective tokenomic system. It's not just a cash grab. And like you said, UMA is a perfect example of that.
I think there are like a lot of designs out there where the token isn't required. And I think that is the right question to ask. And actually, that's where I think bear markets do a better job. In bull markets, people don't ask the question like, do you need a token? You're like, oh yeah, obviously have a token because you can sell it, right? Or something.
Yeah.
But in bear markets, the question of like, wait, what does this token do and what's its purpose? But that does emerge. And I think that that's helpful.
Yeah. All right. So I want to ask next about UMA, because from what I understand, UMA, your main product is an Oracle, but there are some interesting segues that you guys do as well. And one of the things I noticed, KPI options, right? And how it would help DAOs in general. Could you explain a little bit about what this is and, maybe what kind of other products UMA does as well?
Yeah, absolutely, Ben. So, early on, back when we were kind of building this thing out in 2018, we were thinking, remember, DeFi doesn't exist. Like, Uniswap doesn't exist, Compound doesn't exist, this stuff doesn't exist yet. And we're thinking like, okay, how do we communicate to people like what this Oracle can do? And our idea is like, okay, tokens are cool. People kind of grok tokens. Let's make synthetic tokens, what we're calling synthetic tokens. So let's make a crypto token that can track anything, can use our Oracle, which can resolve to any type of data. We can make a crypto token that can kind of track anything. And we sort of went to market again before DeFi existed with this concept of synthetic tokens to explain what we do. We've moved away from that because we think the Oracle is the bigger opportunity or bigger thing to focus on. But we did invent a bunch of cool things along the way. And KPI options are sort of one of them. So the idea, and actually a bunch of DAO tooling things. What we've done recently, like a month ago, to kind of clarify what UMA's doing is we actually created a separate brand. We created a whole other brand for these other products like KPI options that we call Outcome or Outcome Finance. The website's outcome.finance. And the tagline here is for Outcome, the tagline is we help your DAO achieve a positive outcome. And it fits with this idea of KPI options. So KPI option is a token that a DAO collateralizes with their project token. So if Uniswap wanted to do this, they put in a bunch of Uni tokens and you get two things. You get a long token and a short token, right? So two sides of the trade. So each unit of collateral, you get two derivative tokens from it.
Gotcha.
And the DAO keeps one side and then the DAO gives away the other side or airdrops it or distributes it. And that other side can then be programmed to have some payout under a set of conditions. And that set of conditions can be like whatever the DAO wants. Kind of grokkable examples would be we hit a TVL target or like a volume target or what else. And then all the holders of the KPI option are actually really incentivized to try to make that happen. So it's a way to motivate your community to act collectively to achieve some outcome. And it's been pretty cool. Like we use it within our own community called the Superhumans. We give them these KPI options and say, hey, we want to like get some integrations. And they go out there and they're motivated to go and like sell UMA as an integration. And it's been a really kind of cool concept that we've developed.
Yeah, and I think this perfectly showcases the power of oracles because you can use it for so many things, and which it kind of just brings me to my next question. Right, is we kind of dived in a bit to what UMA really does, but maybe taking a step back, can you provide an overview of the Oracle ecosystem and what the industry looks like? And I guess on top of that, elaborate on how important they are and what is the cutting edge technology nowadays?
Yeah, good question. So like go back and ask the basic question. Okay, what does an Oracle do? It gets some bit of data, some truth it's not on a blockchain. It gets it on there. And again, if we go back and we have this model where we're like, okay, smart contracts are super cool. They let us program all these systems that are decentralized. But many smart contracts are only interesting or useful if they know something about the world that doesn't exist on the blockchain itself. So actually, just to go deep on that, Uniswap doesn't need an oracle. Uniswap is just trading crypto assets back and forth. No oracle need. It's kind of the exception, in my opinion. Everything else, like Compound or Aave, they need to know what the US dollar price is of these assets. That maybe that sort of exists on chain if you use like Uniswap as a price oracle. But oftentimes it doesn't, or doesn't in a credible way. And they need to know that because they need to know if they should liquidate you or not. You go to prediction markets in our example here. Really cool to use DeFi to build prediction markets broadly. That's something that's actually quite hard to do. But then you need a way to figure out, well, wait, did outcome A or outcome B happen? If it's really easy to answer those questions in a centralized way, to just like, I can just report, it can be trust Hart and he's going to say, yeah, so-and-so won the soccer game. But then it completely like removes that, like, why are we using a blockchain to do this? Now we're just a completely centralized service. Doing this in a decentralized way is incredibly tricky. It's like just not an easy problem. And I think it's underappreciated how important it is. And there's lots of examples in crypto today where things are happening that are actually sort of centralized. So one good example, many governance votes that happen in Snapshot, actually the vast majority of governance votes that happen in Snapshot is an off-chain system. It's not on-chain. It then requires a multi-sig or a trusted entity to actually go and execute that transaction on-chain. And this isn't a great pattern, right? It's like there is trust in this multi-sig to do what your token holders said, and it's possible they won't. And there's all sorts of security holes or vulnerabilities that I think are like not good. So I guess, Ben, like I went off on a tangent here, but backing up here, the point of oracles here is that we can actually we can bring all this off-chain data on-chain or have all these events happen with like truly without points of centralization. And I'd argue that there are many points here in the crypto ecosystem today where we are not, like, our cutting edge tech is actually to use a multi-sig, which is not decentralized at all, right? And it's not like, we're very early, right?
That's true. Yeah.
So I think concepts like the optimistic oracle, they fit neatly alongside price feed oracles like Chainlink. I think that basically the design space for oracles is still very, very young. These are hard problems. One example I kind of have is like you talked about blockchains in 2017, and the only thing that existed was like proof of work. Like you didn't even mention it, right? And then people realize, well, wait, there's other ways we can do this that have trade-offs. So this proof of stake concept, it does things, it has some trade-offs versus proof of work, and it's a different use case. I kind of think that's exactly where we are with Oracle technology right now, where people's minds default to thinking about price feed oracles as like how an oracle should work. But that's just one way to program them. And it has some trade-offs. Like you really can't use a price feed oracle like Chainlink to figure out if a snapshot vote passed or not. It's not a good use case. And so I think something like our design was optimistic oracle. We fit a different use case that I think is particularly relevant for Web3 as we start asking for more types of data that aren't necessarily price focused. I think it's particularly useful in a multi-chain world where I want to know what things are happening on other blockchains. I think designs like ours actually work quite well in those environments.
Many good points raised, and you kind of actually raised the next question because you brought up multi-chain and cross-chain, right? And then I think for the past few podcasts, we've been talking a little bit about interoperability and cross-chain. And one of the big questions nowadays is, oracles are information providers, they're information verifiers, but what kind of role would they play in cross-chain?
Yeah. So again, if you think about cross-chain systems, what's happening here, each blockchain has no idea what's happening on another blockchain. You have an oracle problem. And there are some engineering ways to do this, where you actually try to build like a client for another blockchain on your blockchain. This is like kind of the Cosmos approach, if you will. But that can be really tricky and expensive too, to do. So generally speaking, like the cross-chain or multi-chain world has this like big oracle problem. I have no idea what's happening on chain B, on chain A. I gotta figure that out. And the optimistic oracle concept here actually, again, works quite well, where I can optimistically say, so-and-so did action XYZ on chain B and report that on chain A, and use it to, in a really like lightweight and cheap way, verify that something happened on another chain. So we actually, it's interesting because many of the cross-chain oracle concepts that are not optimistic are really expensive. They just cost a lot to try to figure out what's happening on another chain, or they're very centralized, like one of those two. This optimistic concept, in practice, it is truly decentralized, and it's also quite cheap, because most of the time you're just saying, hey, this happened on the other chain, and no one's disputing you because it's accurate. And so we've actually used this to build our own cross-chain bridge called Across. Protocols across.to.to. It's like we're able to bridge assets between chains with the lowest fees out there consistently. And the reason for that is it's this very it's very cheap. Like our bridging costs, our oracle costs are quite low.
Wow. This really interesting because we kind of talked a little bit about bridges as well in the past podcast, and this pretty much sounds like what oracles will also come into play. Could we see a future where oracles and bridges become one product, one seamless integration? Is that what you're implying?
Well, kind of, I guess. It's interesting. Like bridges. So the space is, it also shows how early we are. The space is, the space, there's even many types of bridges that function in like very different ways, even though we all kind of think of them the same. So for example, some bridges are like this, like you lock your tokens on one blockchain and it mints a representation of them on another blockchain, right?
Wrapped assets.
Yeah, wrapped assets, right? And first of all, the UX around that can be quite confusing because you could have multiple different wrapped assets that are all supposed to be the same thing, right? So like Ben's bridge could go from Ethereum to Solana and create like wrapped ETH on Solana, and my bridge could do the same thing, but they're different wrapped ETHs, right? That's super kind of confusing. The other example where you don't do that, you don't wrap the assets, but you try to use a canonical version, works in the environments where there is a canonical representation. So layer twos do this. Layer twos all have a canonical bridge. So there's only one version of ETH on a layer two. And I mean, again, I may be getting too deep in the weeds here, but I think that these two types of bridges are actually quite different. Either way, though, you need to know, like, hey, did a user, like if we're using the wrapped version, did a user deposit ETH on Ethereum? If so, like create the wrapped representation on Solana. either way, we got to ask that question. So I think there's this concept of cross-chain messaging that is an Oracle thing. So when people talk about cross-chain messaging and oracles, they are like one and the same. The bridge mechanics, though, probably exist separately of like how the bridge functions. It's got its own set of like financial engineering or design.
Yeah, exactly. I was actually focusing more on the cross-chain messaging because it's very fresh in my mind. I just had the podcast where they all talked about cross-chain messaging, and it sounds pretty much like oracles because ultimately the goal is to maybe one day execute one protocol transaction on one chain and maybe pulling data from another chain and causing it to execute another transaction on that chain as well. So yeah, that's what I'm pretty much getting at.
Yeah, and it's worth going into what's so different about that. So one of the things that in the single chain world, if we just focus on Ethereum, people like to talk about atomic transactions or atomicity, right? So and you can do cool things where you're like, I'm going to take a flash loan from Uniswap and then do this thing on Compound, like do this whole thing, and it's all one transaction that either executes completely or doesn't. When you start going off chain, you can no longer have, going multi-chain, you can no longer have atomic transactions. It's different because the chains they fundamentally have like different execution environments, and you can't like do that. And I think it's really interesting to think through the trade-offs of that and how it actually requires a bit of a different architecture or kind of mindset where I'm not able to trustlessly verify all of these things. And this is still fresh research or things we're working on, but I think there's lots of concepts here that we're toying with because I think the optimistic design pattern can actually work quite well. So I can basically do this whole thing and say, hey, here's that touches all these chains. I do this calculation that touches all these chains, say, hey, here's the outcome. Here's the answer. But there's some challenge window where people would be like, wait, that's not right.
Got it. We talked a lot about oracles, and we kind of diverged into interoperability and bridges. And I just kind of want to rein the conversation back. Kind of like a last final question, because I think we pretty much covered a lot about oracles. It's, an information verifier and provider. But, I kind of want to ask, because I still think, like, as all Web3 infrastructure, it's very underrated. It's all behind the scenes, so people don't really think about them. But it's not as, facing the front as much as protocols like Uniswap, right? So one thing I'd like to ask is, since oracles are effectively the source of truth, acting as the source of truth, there are a lot of implications and there are a lot of use cases that you have shared so far. What would you say is an underrated issue that oracles addresses in the Web3 industry?
Right now, my current target is like multi-sigs that are used to, I think multi-sigs should be our new enemy right now. And again, not because like I'm against them, but I think that they are a lazy shortcut that developers in Web3 are using right now instead of asking a harder question. But like instead of decentralizing it fully. And we actually, so that's like my personal target of how I think we can improve the decentralization and security of like Web3 systems is take a look at everywhere where multi-sigs are being used and look at if there is an alternative. And we are actually doing this. There's a product we're going to launch soon through the Outcome brand that we're calling Optimistic Governance. And it is a product that tries to replace the multi-sig that's used in Snapshot to say whether a vote happened or not. We're trying to replace that with the Optimistic Oracle. So instead, we optimistically look at, did a snapshot vote pass? And if it did, anyone can say, hey, let's execute this transaction in the system, in the Gnosis safe. And anyone can dispute it and say, wait, that's not right either. But basically, the idea that all of these multi-sigs, there are ways that you could turn them into Oracle questions. Like, let's ask, should this transaction be signed or not? And in doing so, you can use a decentralized Oracle versus this point of centralization. So that's my vendetta right now.
Very cool. So, a lot of people always think of oracles as like maybe not UMA, but some people has always mentioned that oracles have become a centralized point of risk, especially when it comes to price manipulation, etc. But assuming the method works, oracles can even be used to improve the decentralization of other things, like the multisig.
Yep. Yeah. To the latter point, like price manipulation and all that, I mean, I have another view of kind of like a price feed style Oracle like Chainlink. There is one problem with price manipulation that I think is real. It's not like Chainlink's fault. Chainlink could perfectly do their job of reporting what an exchange says, but the exchange itself is manipulated. We actually saw this happen when like Venus, the lending protocol, was like hacked. Chainlink didn't report a bad value, but the exchange got manipulated to report so that Chainlink reported a bad value. And the reason why I bring this up is there's another issue, I think, with some of these Oracle designs that the optimistic Oracle nicely sidesteps, but with a trade-off. And that issue is trying to deliver truths like data or whatever else, trying to do things in real time is, I think, very, very hard, right? So saying the price of this is, X in real time is really tricky. And it means that any edge case that goes wrong doesn't get corrected, right? So it's a little bit like, we go back to the legal example. It's executing legal contracts in real time with no recourse, like zero recourse. You're like, that's scary. Like, things could go wrong. So I think it's also interesting for people in the crypto space to go and think of, if something does go wrong, what happens? And the optimistic Oracle slows things down. So its biggest downside is it takes a second. There's a challenge period now. But there is a concept of sort of recourse, or this like undo button where you can dispute things if they're not right.
Yeah. I mean, it's the trade-offs, right? Like you mentioned, you are asking for more security and accuracy in lieu of faster, more efficient times. And I guess the goal will ultimately be to cut down as much time as possible it takes to make it as real time as possible.
Yeah. Or you find use cases where the real timeness isn't important. Again, like the multi-sig question. Most multi-sig questions, like multi-sigs are slow. You got to go get all these people to sign stuff. So that actually seems like a good use case to frame it as an Oracle question that uses a different service, right? So and then, in terms of getting the price of Ethereum on a blockchain, I mean, in that case, Chainlink does seem like it works pretty well, and it's close to real time. So again, kind of highlights just how big the design space is and how many cool ideas are still yet to emerge.
Great. We've had a really good chat so far, Hart. And before I close off the session, I always like to ask, is there anything else you would like to share, or did you feel that there was something I should have asked but did not that you would like to talk about?
The only thing I'll add for your audience is that this cross-chain protocol we created called a cross-chain bridge. the community is going to launch a token associated with it, and we're also launching a super cool referral program where users can can earn across tokens for referring users to the bridge itself. And I'm actually pretty excited about the design of this referral program because I think some of these programs work pretty well. It's a very interesting way for users of the bridge to earn ownership in the protocol itself by telling people about it. And so, yeah, Ben, that's the only thing I'd be like, people should go check out Across and go check out this referral program. It should probably be live by the time this airs. And I think it's like the bridge works really well. It's super secure and super cheap. And we'd love kind of feedback from the community.
Yeah, awesome. You guys heard it here first, so do check it out. And I guess with that, it's time to close the session. Thank you so much, Hart, for coming on.
Ben, thank you for having me.
For the latest crypto prices, visit our website. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to keep up to date on the latest crypto trends.